perform subversion within Israel. Okay. So it said he embraced them. Mm-hmm. I took it as literal, and it seemed like it was. It said he would embrace them afterwards, so maybe. Brother, yeah, the hair sniffings, stuff like that. I don't know.
He didn't really seek people out. He kind of sat and waited and let them come to him, and just kind of planted that seed of, listen, he's really not going to have time for you. But if I was him, here's what I would do, and here's what I would say.
Right.
He didn't really prevent them from continuing on, but he did very much put himself in a place of a solution to what they were looking for at that time.
Right. And he was already, we, in our brain, for some reason, we're wired to think that handsome people are good leaders or intelligent.
And he had that credibility as the king's son.
Right.
I mean, he wasn't just a nobody. He already had.
Well, and Scripture said he was very, very handsome.
Charismatic.
What, easier to follow good-looking people than ugly people?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, that's why Kennedy won the election and Nixon lost. Nixon was way ahead in the polls.
Yeah.
And had more experience until the first ever televised debate, and Kennedy jumped way ahead. Unfortunately, that's a fact.
So what's
Yep.
the problem with North Korea?
No.
There's plenty of attractive Koreans.
They don't get to elect their leader.
He is not. He's not up there.
All right, so
So, oh gosh, yeah, don't put that on the internet. They'll really come after. Sorry.
yeah. So Absalom created division in Israel because he knew he couldn't take on David face to face, right?
Was a warrior.
Yeah. And he had commanders that worked for him, that followed him, that were just as experienced in war. Did Absalom succeed in his subversion of David?
Kind of, sort of?
He did,
Oh,
but he
he
didn't
did,
get
but-
crowned fully. So.
Right. So he got to basically the crisis stage, right? So they went through a crisis. Israel went against Israel. And then Absalom was killed against the king's orders. Just again, it teaches to the character of David. Even after all that, he still wanted his son back. And then through his wisdom, through the wisdom of God, when his advisor told him, when David started weeping, "Why are you weeping? You're basically shaming the people that went to war for you." And he said, basically told him to get lost, and he said, "These are my brothers and my blood. Why wouldn't I accept them back?" So the defeat of subversion went to God on that one. So that's an instance in history where subversion didn't fully succeed. And now we're going to look at an instance where it did. So to do that, we have to do a crash course in economics, just real quick. So capitalism, we should be familiar with what capitalism is, right? Individual parties, through their own interests, conduct an exchange in goods and services. That's essentially, when you dumb down capitalism, that's what it is, a privatized economy. Two parties. Make sense? Private parties own and control their own property, conducting an exchange to meet supply and demand. Well, some people will say, well, that gives way to monopolies. You know, someone can corner the market, can, you know, basically make it impossible for other people to compete. But through,
What's happening right now?
huh?
Isn't that what's happening right now?
Depends on what form of capitalism we're talking about, and I'll get to that. So if generally, statistically, if a party, so let's say you're, what's a good example? GM, yeah, GM, so let's say GM, go ahead,
US Steel,
US Steel, that's a
Yeah.
good one.
because they actually got broken up.
Yep, they did. But I'll do one that we're probably more familiar with. So GM, let's say GM overprices their vehicles. And generally, what are people going to do? Are they going to, if they're the only person or only company that provides that service, then they're pretty much stuck with that relationship. But what happens in a capitalist economy is another person, because a party has its own interest in mind, it's going to seek a way to be competitive, to, you know, it'll see an advantage to come under and take business away from that. So you get companies like Kia or Hyundai, you know, that offer a pretty much on par, maybe not the highest quality, but as a consumer, you have to weigh quality versus price. What can I afford versus quality? So that's when you get car manufacturers like Kia or Hyundai who offer a more affordable vehicle, and, you know, may not be up to the quality standards of Toyota or Acura, but they do well. So that's how the market kind of corrects itself. And then over time, GM or someone that's more expensive that's trying to hit that market will correct their prices, and it'll level out. So that's just statistically what happens. And then you have your crony capitalism, which is basically what we'll be looking at here in a little bit, where you have these corporations that form a relationship with the government to lobby and create their benefits for themselves. And that's when you get into monopolies. Google. Excuse me. The second, so I'm just going over the two main economic systems that we're familiar with, or should be. Second one is communism. So modern communism was established by Karl Marx in 1848 when he established the Communist Manifesto. And this is a classless economic system where goods and services are basically regulated through a central party, which is usually the governing party. Go ahead.
I think classless is not correct, because the governing party is a class.
Well, yes. But if you're explaining that in terms of civilians versus a governing class, this area here is what I'm talking to.
Okay.
That's a classless system. So there's no private ownership of land, but it's instead communally owned. So everybody, regardless of what your role or responsibility is in that society, is making the same amount of money, working the same amount of hours, and you're not allowed. You don't own private land, so it's all communal. That's what communism means: communal, a redistribution of goods. All right, so those are your two main economic systems. Go ahead.
How does socialism differ from communism?
They just say they offer a better solution, but it's not too different, barely. So that's the big argument right now is socialists say, well, we can we can hop on the backs of Karl Marx and offer a better solution, but it's still the same horse. It's still, when you dumb it down, it's still this system. It's still a class of people that receive equal outcome, is what the main goal is, equal outcome, regardless of what you do. And we're starting to see that in a couple of the main businesses that I deal with are required to hire a certain amount of women into their executive levels, regardless of their qualification. Because they want equal outcomes for both male and female, instead of equal opportunity, which is based on the opportunity to enter a position like that, regardless of your sex. So that's another kind of policy of the social communist party. Are we on the same page? Okay. So, has anybody studied the history of Russia?
Bolsheviks.
A little bit.
A little bit?
A long time ago.
Yeah.
A little bit, a long time ago.
It's a very interesting history. I would recommend if you're bored that you would study the history of Russia. It's an
Tried to
interesting
read War and Peace.
interesting country, huh?
Tried to read War and Peace,
Yeah.
but,
Tolstoy gets kind of wordy, doesn't he?
yes.
I didn't say Russian literature. I just said
That covers the
history of
time
Russia.
period.
Yeah.
Watch Tales from a Young Doctor's Notebook. That's an even better look
Yeah.
at it.
All right. So 1917. What was going on during that time in the world? 1917.
War.
All right. What started World War I off?
People.
Shoot,
People.
Franz
Well,
Ferdinand?
Ferdinand.
Uh,
Franz Ferdinand, the man.
Take me out.
A high official was shot in, I think,
Yep. You got it. So they already said his name.
well,
I was like, you're shooting me, fall down.
I think it was France or somewhere, or one of the United Nations, or
There you go. What'd you say, Emmy?
Austria.
Yeah. Austria-Hungary. Yeah. So that's kind of what I mean. There was conflicts that were leading up to that, but that's what basically sent it into action. So during this time, before I get back there, given that both of these economic systems are led by people, men, they all have their issues. I'm not toting one way or the other. Unless you ask me personally, then I would, but for this purpose of this, I'm being objective. But in itself, capitalism has proven to be destructive as well when left unregulated. I don't know if anybody has driven through Butte, Montana, but that serves as evidence to what happens when, corporations are left unregulated. That whole area, those of you who aren't familiar with Butte and Anaconda area, that was a huge copper mine, and they built a smelter with no regard for the environment. And if you look in Anaconda, everything above the smelter stack is dead. And that was over 100 years ago. And they've got it's a multi-generation project going on right now where they're replacing all of the topsoil in that area. I forget how many thousands of square miles, acres. So given, the benefits of capitalism, there's also, it's led by people. It's faulty as well, especially when it goes unregulated. And the same for social media, right? So our those of you that have had a chance to watch the show on Netflix, you know, it goes through social media, and it's one of the few industries where there are no laws or regulations that exist
What is?
for our data,
Social media.
social media.
Okay.
And if you want an interesting read, The War of the Copper Kings, which is about that area in Montana, and the two brothers that established that copper mine is pretty crazy. All right, so in 1917, there was a right-wing government that made up Russia, which is called the Provisional Government. So it was essentially what I explained as a crony capitalist government. So they were capitalists, but there was a relationship between their major corporations and the government. So both parties benefited. So they had what was considered, or what they called the peasant class, or blue collar. We would call them blue collar workers. What are blue collar workers?
Your
People that
essential
work.
workers? People that do the actual work.
Yeah, people that do the actual work. That's right. So your factory, your steel workers, your carpenters,
Grocers,
your grocers, yep,
childcare.
transportation, all those. So the original purpose of the provisional government was not too different than ours. It was to organize an election process, provides freedom of speech, press, assembly, religion, political ideology, to limit military authority and remove restrictions on classes and institute a local government system. So not too different from ours. But it lasted 8 months in Russia until what they call the October Revolution. So why did it only last for that short period of time? Well, given the fact that World War I was going on and the majority of Russia did not want to be involved in World War I, so they were opposed to the provisional government because provisional government supported it. Go ahead.
I don't remember what form of government did they have prior to that.
Um,
Was
They
it
had a
the czar?
monarchy, didn't they? Mm-hmm. It was a monarchy.
Monarchy, right? With the
I
czar?
think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, context is important here.
Yeah.
Wasn't Vladimir Lenin like
Hold on.
shipped off to?
Yep. We'll get there.
Okay.
Wow. I'm surprised you guys know your stuff.
That's not
I shouldn't be surprised. I didn't know anything about Russia a month ago,
Well,
except who
Oh, they're crazy.
Putin was. Well, I knew that, but
No, but
Historically.
they've been crazy.
Yeah.
It just changes a little bit as the decades go on.
right.
Yeah.
You know what, if they ever really become a democracy, we're in trouble.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And what I've read in the Gulag Archipelago. All right. So you had blue collar workers that didn't want to be involved in World War I. The industry was suffering. It had decreased by almost 50% at the start of the war, or during the start of the war. And Russia was in debt about 50 billion rubles, which is equivalent to 639 million. So they began blaming the factory workers, the metal workers began blaming their managers, and oftentimes would attack them. And then they began blaming the rich and influential people. They would blame them for their poor living conditions, the shortage of food. And that's when Russia saw one of the largest strikes it's ever saw. Over 1 million people went on strike.
It's called a revolt.
Yeah. And then 50% of the young men were sent off to war, which left a lot of women widowed and frustrated and seeking resolution. So it was during this time, as David mentioned earlier on, Vladimir Lenin was exiled.
Poland
No, Switzerland.
or Switzerland.
Good try. And anybody associated with Lenin was to be executed, was the command given by the provisional government. So when he observed the unrest of Russia, he came back. Go ahead.
Just wondering why he was exiled.
He was exiled because of his support in the previous, trying to remember. I'll have to come back to that.
Okay.
I'll let you know. Because him and his Bolshevik followers were part of, I'm not going to speak out of ignorance, so I'll come back to that. So when Lenin came back, he reestablished the Bolsheviks, which was a group of followers that followed Lenin and followed Marxist communist manifesto to a T. So they returned and they took advantage of these blue-collar workers and their situation, being without food or low food, no income, low income, and they began influencing these workers and organizing riots and strikes, and that's what led to this event where over 1 million workers went on strike. So the Bolsheviks' influence on these blue-collar workers, or peasants, what they were called, went to the point where in September of that year, of 1917, more than 1 million workers went on strike, and they began opposing the government authority. And then, through their influence, the people began electing, because remember they instituted an election process, the people began electing members of the Bolshevik faction into power, into their government. And then that's when Leon Trotsky, who was elected, established a revolutionary army. And he worked closely with Vladimir Lenin. And the army was made up of workers and Bolsheviks. So workers joined this revolutionary army to basically create a coup in the government. And then in October, the army conducted an insurrection in St. Petersburg, as well as the Winter Palace, and overtook the government. And that's now what we consider to be the October Revolution. So at that point, the new formed cabinet of Bolsheviks set Vladimir Lenin as their leader. So Vladimir Lenin became their leader, and he went straight to work implementing
The red chair.
the communist manifesto, essentially. So all private landowners he instituted the following decrees. All private landowners by peasants and workers was to be taken and redistributed. Again, communal redistribution. All banks were to be nationalized. All private banks were to be abolished. All property of churches were to be taken and nationalized. All wages were fixed. and 8-hour workdays were required. Labor unions were established who had control of factories. So if you think unions in the U.S. are our invention, think again. Peasants were required to give up their surplus of food to the state at a fixed rate. So whatever surplus that they grew each year, they had to sell to the government at a government stated rate that was fixed. So in retaliation, the farmers began not reporting their surplus. Anything they grew that was not essential to them and their community, they would not report. And the government or the nation saw one of the largest food shortages in their history. 80%, let's see. Yeah, so these farmers grew 80 to 85% of the nation's food. And can you imagine what would happen if they quit reporting and supplying their surplus? So it was at this time. What's that?
What happens to the surplus?
They would keep it. They would hide it.
So the farmer's family has extra food, but what about all the people that live in the cities that don't grow their own food?
Yeah.
So Lenin sent the army in to.
I'm getting her. I'm getting her.
I'm reading it on Wiki. For history, it's not bad.
So that's when, it was during this time when Joseph Lenin took power, succeeded Stalin. And,
Latin or
huh?
Lenin? Joseph Lenin?
Or, sorry,
Lenin.
Joseph Stalin.
Stalin.
Yeah.
Sorry. So he took power, and he already had a disdain for these peasants, farmers. So he started sending them off to gulags, which are what?
Prisons.
Prisons, right? Working forced labor,
Concentration camps.
concentration camps. I mentioned the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. That's a pretty good read, pretty long, but if you have time, I'd read that. So what did Joseph Stalin do when he started shipping these people off to concentration camps? He would start replacing them with government workers, right, to basically substitute as farmers. And these social workers, essentially, had limited knowledge, if not no knowledge of farming. So it did more harm than good. And then by 1929, Russia saw one of the largest food shortages they ever in history. So if you think about it, the people, the peasants that Stalin was shipping off to the gulags were the same people that were on strike, were being motivated to revolt against the government by the Bolsheviks. So the Bolsheviks basically kind of took their momentum and led them down a path, and they elected the Bolsheviks, and then they joined their army, they supported them, and now the same people are shipping them off to forced labor camps. Didn't really work out for them. And that's one of the kind of clear forms of a successful subversion. So Stalin had a vision to overthrow their government and implement communism. And through, obviously he was in exile, so he couldn't directly oppose the provisional government. Here, I've got it. review. So Lenin and the Bolsheviks followed Sun Tzu's teaching. Remember that the individuals do not shun the aid of the lowest, most despicable individuals, because they are probably the most powerful force in a well, they are the revolution, essentially. So Lenin used the individuals, what was it that Stotsky said? The useful idiots of the world, united them. And through demoralization, the Bolsheviks helped feed a lack of trust and increased animosity between the workers and peasants and the provisional government, as well as offering a better solution through communism. So, they promised redistribution of goods, redistribution of wealth, everybody would be successful. So they did this through little conflict with the current government, but through influencing its people. Destabilization, the urban workers and peasants formed riots and strikes led by the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks took advantage of their unrest and distrust to motivate them. And then the crisis, obviously Russia saw a largest strike and food shortage in the history at that time. And then normalization. So Lenin and Stalin implemented a new normal called communism, which has essentially been in place in Russia since that's what's currently in place. So I'd say they were pretty successful in what they accomplished.
Interesting note, Joseph Stalin took editorship of the major newspaper in Russia.
Yeah.
10 years plus before the revolution of 1817, to destabilize and turn the opinion against the ruling, the Tsar. It's all coming back to me now.
That's one thing, remember we talked about with Absalom too. This stage here, demoralization, is a very kind of a long, patient process. How long did Absalom remain outside of Israel?
40 years.
40 years, yeah, influencing. He had
Why is it always?
officials.
Was he outside Israel?
He waited outside the gate.
Outside the gate?
yes,
Oh,
sorry.
Jerusalem, right?
Right,
So he was back in Israel, but he
Yeah.
was not.
yeah.
Okay.
We did it the same way when we pulled away from Britain's rule. I mean, the colonies had been largely settled and populated for 100 years or so before the American Revolution, and the newspaper that was how people were stirred to action, was the publishing of newspapers and pamphlets, and each little faction had their own, printing style, and small groups of people, whispers turning into movements like that.
What she really wants to say is praise the Lord for Alexander Hamilton.
I don't think I would like him as a person, if
Probably
I'm
not.
there. He's not a subverter. He was a let's go chop off their head kind of
He
a
was
person.
used by subverters. He was an instrument, yep.
Okay. What time is it? Do I want to get? Let's call it there. So, gave you an instance of subversion that failed, one that succeeded, and then we're going to look at current examples and what that means for us. Go ahead.
What was the reference on this time period that you said you read?
1917?
1917 or,
What was
oh,
the
the
reference?
references?
Yeah, where are you pulling all this from?
Uh,
Said you read something that you didn't know about a month ago.
yeah. I thought I wrote it down here. Well, a lot of it came from this guy, Thomas Schumann. So he was a KGB defective, so he worked for KGB. It's a KGB.
Well, you could pull Russia's history,
Yeah.
History Channel, or that's pretty common. That series of events you can
Yeah.
get from a lot of different.
But he was familiar with, obviously, the Russian government and its history and subversion tactics, because Russia, something I didn't, well, I put in my notes, but Russia teaches subversion tactics to the KGB. So it's a, I think a 1 or 2 year course that they implement. Go ahead.
What's the KGB?
Oh, I forget what the acronym stands for. It's Russian, but it's their, it's
CIA,
essentially their
Russia.
CIA, yeah.
Okay.
But on a whole nother level.
Does K
Of-
stand for Kremlin?
Huh?
Kremlin.
No.
Good.
What was that?
Boo-boos.
Something.
It's Russian.
Committee for State Security is what it translates to in English.
It's their CIA, Central Intelligence
Yeah.
Agency. And
When I think of that, I think of
they,
National.
I think of Hunt for October.
Hunt for Red October. That's a submarine. That was World War II.
Yeah, I
Isn't
keep, when I think of
Oh.
Russia, I always think of that movie, Hunt for October.
Yeah.
What submarine?
what?
All right.
Have we ever been allied with Russia in any sort of confrontation?
Well, yeah, World War I, we were allied with them.
Really?
Yeah.
So they,
World War I, World War II, we were.
for a little.
We went against Germany. Yeah.
They were an allied power?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
It was France, England, us, and Russia.
Yep. Essentially, those groups have been allied for a long, for both wars. Yeah, World War I and World War II.
All done?
Yep. Close it.
Wait, what about? Totally getting off topic.
What?
No, I was gonna say China. I don't think we've ever.
No.
China's new.
China is not new.
Well,
China is one of the oldest civilizations in the world.
You always say you don't wanna be a clown, so stop being a clown.
They weren't really involved.
The sign
for
for
They were-
Russia
is
is
We've-
this, and the reason is because